Hello and welcome to our didactic series on emergency department crowding. This is Module 1, What is crowding and why does it matter? I'm Brian Franklin. I have the privilege of working with Eric Goralnick on these modules. This is Module 1 in a three-part series. Today we'll talk about what crowding is and why it matters. Module 2 will address the causes of ED crowding. And in Module 3 we'll discuss potential countermeasures to ED crowding. For today's talk, we'll start by discussing the importance of crowding. We'll then define crowding and some of the related terminology, and finally we'll explore some of the deleterious effects of ED crowding. So for decades, a variety of professional organizations and regulatory bodies have recognized emergency department crowding as a critical threat to patient safety. In 2006, the Institute of Medicine, as it was called at the time, declared ED crowding a national epidemic. You can also see that ACEP, the Joint Commission, and the National Academy of Medicine have all since variously articulated how and why ED crowding is a pervasive problem. So what does it mean to say that ED crowding is a critical threat to patient safety? Well, there's an ever-growing body of literature that associates ED crowding with deleterious effects, including delayed administration of antibiotics and pain medications, reduced patient satisfaction, increased staff burnout, and increased rates of adverse events, including mortality. Here's a look at an article from Annals of Emergency Medicine in 2003 and from Academic Emergency Medicine in 2004. The Annals article was a point prevalence study where they asked a variety of EDs over the course of a single week how prevalent crowding had been. You can see that in that period, almost half of EDs were boarding inpatients. 31% of them had been on ambulance diversion at some point that week, and 59% of them had been using hallways for patient care. That was 2003. Now it's 2022, and you can see that ED crowding is, of course, still very much in the headlines. Hospital capacity, as we all know, became elevated to the national stage at the onset of COVID, and at the current stage of the pandemic, with ED volumes having rebounded at many sites, you can see ED crowding remains a topic of popular interest today because it is routinely affecting everyday people. Let's now more formally define crowding and introduce some related terminology. First, let's clarify what crowding is, and sometimes you'll hear people call it overcrowding. The ACEP definition for crowding is that crowding occurs when the identified need for emergency services exceeds available resources for patient care in the ED, hospital, or both. So that's a conceptual definition of crowding. If you want to write about crowding as a researcher or discuss it as an administrator, you have to decide how you want to define it quantitatively. Different studies have done this different ways. So you could, for example, define crowding as a condition in which ED census is greater than capacity. So, for example, if all ED beds are full for more than 6 hours a day, that could be considered crowding. If patients have been placed in a hallway for more than 6 hours a day, that could be considered crowding. Alternatively, you could define crowding as whenever the wait time to see a provider exceeds a certain amount of time, so 60 minutes, for example. Or you could even define crowding as a state in which providers or other team members feel rushed for more than a certain number of hours per day. This slide is to clarify the difference between boarding and crowding. So a patient's considered to be boarding in the ED from the moment that they've been admitted to the hospital until the time they exit the ED. Boarding of patients in the ED occurs because no inpatient beds are available, and boarding is a major driver of crowding, which we'll discuss further in Module 2. Finally, let's talk about some of the effects of ED crowding. So we started to talk about this at the beginning, but ED crowding, of course, impacts patients, caregivers, and health system performance. In terms of patients, we talked about how ED crowding is associated with delayed assessment and care of patients, which has been quantified in terms of delayed initiation of sepsis bundles and delayed administration of medications. For caregivers, ED crowding has been associated with increased rates of burnout. And of course, ED crowding affects a wide array of operational measures. Crowded EDs have increased rates of patients who leave without being seen or leave before their treatment is complete, which is both a risk to patient safety and, of course, a source of lost revenue for the ED. Same goes for ambulance diversions. ED crowding is also associated with increased ED length of stay. And interestingly, the causality goes both ways. So, of course, patients who have a long ED length of stay, for example, because they're stuck boarding in the ED, those patients are going to be part of the cause of crowding. But a crowded emergency department is also a less efficient emergency department, and so new patients who enter that crowded environment will also tend to have an increased ED length of stay as a result, which of course exacerbates crowding in the first place, and so you have this vicious cycle. And finally, EDs that are chronically crowded may have a reduced ability to respond effectively to mass casualty events when needed. So in summary, in this short introductory module, we discussed the definition of ED crowding, which occurs when the need for emergency services exceeds available resources, whether that's in the ED itself, in the inpatient environment, or both. We talked about how ED crowding is both prevalent and persistent. It was a big problem in 2003, and it will surely be a big problem in 2023. And finally, we began to discuss examples of the effects that ED crowding has on patients, caregivers, and the health system. For more on the drivers of ED crowding and some of the countermeasures that have been proposed, check out modules 2 and 3. Hope to see you there.